A project that myself, Rowan, Saskia and Lauren have been involved in setting up. We haven't conducted the project yet. This was just a kind of initial design plan for the project and our initial thoughts about that. And we're talking about the phenomena of the raising of the Union Jack, the St George's flag in the UK in the summer of last year, and how that's kind of continued over the last few months. So we're kind of doing some qualitative discursive ethnography and sociography work, which we're going to talk about. So I'll hand you over to Rowan, who's going to talk about the rationale for the study and explain a bit more about what the flag raising is about and the impact.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So you may have noticed, I think something about when I mention this study to people that this is what we're thinking about doing, what I often get back is a very personal story around, oh yes, there's a flag outside my house, or oh, I know this street, or there's a Union Jack hanging, get a tattoo somewhere. And so it's really interesting. I think that's part of the rationale is when I was sounding out this project was actually getting that feedback of this is kind of a phenomenon that we're all sharing, but it's very localized. It's felt differently for different people in different places. And so, yeah, that's what it was most interesting in. So if you've been, if you haven't seen flags near where you live, this was following in summer last year, 2025. There was Operation Raise the Colours, which Alex will talk more about, the kind of the stemming of this, but it was encouraging people to show patriotism through hanging of flags. And we've seen this both through the St George's Cross, which is the Red Cross and the White, and the Union Jack as well. It was really interesting because I was actually in the north of Ireland visiting some horses and their human when this was happening, and I obviously very different political context there. It has its own kind of roots in politics and meanings. But it was when I was visiting that holiday in 2025, and then I came back and suddenly I was noticing these, and I thought, did I bring them with me in my shoes? What's happened? So it did seem to pop up quite suddenly, but I think obviously it is a imagery, it is a kind of a consequent symptom of other stuff going on. It's not just about flags. So part of the kind of personal rationale of doing it. Not a lot of academic data that I can find, but that can also be a bit of a publishing lag as well. There's some stuff around kind of symbols of nationalism, of flag stuff that I found older, but I can't find anything relating to kind of last summer. But as you know, publishing can take a long time. So if you do know other colleagues or other people working on similar, do let me know. But we do have some more kind of, poll data. Often, coming, this is from More in Common, and then the next slide is YouGov. And for some reason, Good Morning Britain did their own poll on the flags. And there's some interesting stuff we can see that's going on. These are just a few questions that I pulled out, but this one was really interesting because it was thinking about people putting up flags next to them if they saw their neighbour putting up a flag. What would they think of their neighbour? So that's this question there. Would it change their opinion of them? So this is showing us some social stuff going on around kind of relationships and communities. So this was quite an interesting question around what we think of other people. And this was a question around why people were putting up the flags. And again, there was differences in the reasons people thought the flags were being put up and were being shown. So they were being read in different ways. They were being experienced different ways, but also the reasons why people thought the flags were being raised were seen as different as well. And then this data from YouGov shows how the experience of the flags, whether they're seen as threatening or not. And I think two interesting things going on here. One, that it's slightly different for the Union Jack and the St George's Cross, and I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about these kind of different discursive work that these two flags are doing. The St George's Cross was actually seen as being more threatening than the Union Jack, which is kind of weird actually from a personal history. I could see some world where the St George's Cross has a different, better meanings than maybe how it's being read now. I can't see a world where I'd ever feel comfortable with the Union Jack, but there is some branding that has happened. I don't know if it's from royalty, from Jerry Halliway, through there's a softening of what the Union Jack does compared to maybe a class difference as well, that the St George's Cross is seen as maybe more a working class symbol. I'm not sure. There's some stuff to be done there, though, some discussions to be had. And also that that non-white participants in these studies were felt more threatened by the flags than their white counterparts. So that's the data. These were kind of sets of kind of around 2,000 to 3,000 people, but that's kind of not where we're coming from these big data sets, although I do think it is interesting. We really want to start quite a small scale qualitative study around, just a handful of participants about their experiences in the everyday. And I'll talk a little bit more about the methods later, but how they experience coming across flags within their communities. And I've kind of talked about a little bit already. I think there is something interesting and to unpack around the differences between the Union Jack. Although apparently it only called a Union Jack when at sea, it should actually called a Union flag, which I didn't know. But yeah, so there's differences between the Union Jack flag and the St George's Cross. Are they doing different discursive work? And also, it has become a divisive issue. There is ideas of, is it pride? Is it protest? Can we have a progressive form of patriotism? Even kind of thinking about as a left, have we let this happen? Have we let the far right have these symbols? Can we reclaim them on the left? Can we have a positive form of patriotism that's not based on kind of colonialism? I don't know. Or are they just going to be symbols of fascism? But again, I think these are quite too binary. And I think what we know about people, we're very complex, and we can have different kind of pull on different discourses and then anti-discourses in the same time on the same day. We're very complex people. So I'd really like to know about what's actually going on in the everyday to kind of maybe trouble some of these binaries as well. And it links to the need to challenge anti-migrant and racist views as well that we're seeing kind of maybe spoken more boldly. And I think that shows in that the non-white participants polled differently, did feel more threatened by the flag. Feeds into these dialogues, kind of deconstructing how journalists, political leaders, social influencers are talking about migration and nationalism. Although this is just kind of one aspect of that, or one visual signifier, actually what work is that doing, or what does it tie into? And also maybe as a beginning of conversation as well, by kind of hinging it on flags, but talking more about people's views on these topics, placing it really in the everydayness. That is what I'm interested in, just that everydayness of people's experiences. We're building a project. I'm going to talk a bit more about this. As Alex is going to take through some of the historical context, but we're hoping to do a hybrid, go along methods, DIY map making, to help contextualise the complex and nuanced ways people are navigating these symbols of nationalism in everyday environments. But we're very much at the planning stage, so please do come to us with your ideas and comments.
So it's important to start with the historical context of the flag raising phenomena. And so, as someone that's used discourse analysis over the years, I think it's important to look back at some of Foucault's work in this idea of discourse as to how they don't just appear in the everyday in the context of here and now, but how these discourses trace through history. And to think about this idea of, well, why do people raise the Union Jack, or if they raise the St George flag, and where that comes back to? Some of it comes back to this idea of pride and this idea of when Britain was a great country, and the idea of the British Empire. So this is just a map of the British colonies in the early 1900s and which countries they'd occupied. And I think that's important as a starting point to see that, this was, the emergence of capitalism in the 1800s and the kind of the slave trade and all these other things, and what actually made Britain a great, we call it great country at the time, and how that was based on exploitation and oppression. So I think that to me is a starting point to think about these ideas of like the early 1900s, and to think, what does it mean when someone plants a flag in the ground, and how that marks out territory in a particular way, how that links into ideas around coloniality, structural institutional racism, and the kind of idea of the British Empire. So we can start from the beginnings of the British Empire, and then particular legislation like the Aliens Act of 1905, which was inherently very discriminatory towards outsiders, people that moved to the UK, and it kind of vilified and ostracised many people at the time, right through to the 1960s with Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, and then how recently Keir Starmer from the Labour Party in the UK kind of drew on some of that language that drew on kind of Enoch Powell's speech and kind of backtracked on that, say, oh, look, I don't mean it in this kind of discriminatory, divisive way, but it's quite clear that they're adopting some of those tactics of parties like Reform and Restore UK to kind of, get the vote. So there's lots of problematic dimensions to this. So it's not just about the flags, but it's to do with politics and language and how these things get then circulated through the media, through politicians, through social influencers, and then how that becomes part of people's internal everyday ways in which they talk about things, like the migrants are the problem, or we've got the NHS is in crisis because it's the migrants that have come and taken all the jobs and all those repertoires that can become so naturalised and commonsensical. So that's also the kind of foundations of the project, to think about discourses of nationhood, subjectivity and identity, and to place that in historical context to kind of deconstruct some of that content. So these are basically kind of like theoretical reference points for the work. First of all, the work of J.B. Harley, who basically did a lot of writing around kind of deconstructing maps and how maps represent coloniality. They're not these objective measurement. They don't just objectively place territories, boundaries and countries, but they're actually doing something. And a lot of maps kind of like usually put Britain, the British Empire and Europe in the middle. And then you have this relationship of the Middle East. Well, where is it middle to? The whole idea of maps and talking about them kind of draws back on colonial assumptions of what's in the centre and what's in the east and what's in the west and those things. So that's another reference point for it as well. Secondly, the work of Paul Gilroy, important cultural studies work in the 70s and 80s around what does the Union Jack flag represent. And then finally, the work of Foucault on heterotopias and this idea of kind of, for me, I think the idea of the flags is this idea of kind of placing the flag into constructing this kind of idealized way in which the world or this territory could be. And we'll come back to that idea about heterotopias in a few moments. Just quickly, moving along, Rowan spoke before about Operation Raise the Colours. So this is a group that began in South Birmingham in August 2025. They started putting Union Jacks on lampposts and painting roundabouts red and white. And it was all part of promoting unity and patriotism. And on their website, I used DuckDuckGo to go on the website because I didn't want it to track me and then spam me with loads of stuff. They talk about you should do activism, but do it lawfully. We're not promoting vigilante behaviour. So they're already kind of positioning their points on the website in a particular way. And this is a group that's supported by groups such as Britain First and Tommy Robinson. Bit of a Freudian stuff on this slide. Like Rowan mentioned, actually, you wrote this slide, but it should say Operation Raise the Colours. And I decided not to change it back because it's kind of like for the Lacanians in the audience and the psychoanalysts, it's kind of like my intentional position on that. But it's the Operation Raise the Colours. They're talking about unity, but to me, it seems more about kind of opposition and something quite different. So we did this I kind of presented this in terms of Operation Raise the Colours, who supports this group and who's against it. And I thought that would be a useful starting point to think about the groups that are against it, such as BLM, Hope Not Hate, Stand Up to Racism, activist groups, community groups. And then people that express support for this group are obviously Reform, Restore UK, Britain First, Prioritise Britain, and then kind of a bit less so the Conservative Party and the Labour Party because they don't want to express full support and those sorts of things. So just some brief analytic ideas. And these are really kind of like things that we're thinking about in terms of the concepts that will be used to analyse the data. The first is about significatory chains of association. So what does the flag represent for people? How do people make sense of that? I think, the work of people like Roland Barthes, and even some of the psychoanalytic ideas about those kind of chains of association and what flags mean to different people, and kind of disrupting and taking apart those representations and seeing what those things mean for people is important. So some of the initial work in this area has talked about threats to the nation presented as migrants, trans people and feminists. So that's automatically a particular, things begin to be stuck in particular ways, that it's the migrants that problem, it's trans people, it's feminists. And then with that comes these ideas of nationalism, fascism, anti-trans views, the manosphere, and so on. So we see with this also the social media environment has become weaponized, that it has become this way that this misinformation can be spread. And it's not uncommon now for people to have been so absorbed in the conspiracy theories and misinformation that we just see that as the way that things are. So there's a lot of disinformation that's been spread, and this has then been taken up, right down to the recent stuff by Trump, where he's saying that it doesn't look like Jesus, I'm a doctor, and all these sort of things, and this other stuff. So demographic data, Rowan's already spoken about some of that already. This is some of the information that's coming out at the moment in terms of the UK general elections coming up in 2 years. Reform are saying, if you vote for us, we'll stop the votes in 100 days. But actually, a lot of younger people aren't following the line of Reform, and they're actually, probably voting Green and so on. So there's some demographic differences in people's views on this topic. Final couple of points. Nationalism, far-right views are becoming ordinary, normalised and mainstreamed. So there's some important stuff there from critical media studies in terms of kind of disinformation, media gaslighting, and how the media is kind of pulling people in emotionally to kind of think about things in particular ways, which we need to talk about. And you can't do media analysis without some reference to Guy Debord and the idea of society of the spectacle, and returning back to Marx and the idea of capital. To think about how the media is kind of presented as this kind of massive spectacle where we're just meant to kind of look at these images and absorb everything.
Yeah, and I think kind of bringing those that theory together has made us think about how are we actually going to do this, and we're still in the kind of planning phases. But one of our team members, Lauren Smith, they have done some excellent research on ethnography, but on digital platforms. And then myself and Alex are more used to kind of, in the communities, out in kind of physical communities, material communities. Can we bring them together? Are they separate? How do we do that with a coherent and ethical research project? So we were having discussions around whether there's something around that with our participants. We look at how they're responding to the flags in their everyday life through walking methods, but also bringing in maybe how that might tie into their online communities as well. Do they stop and take a picture of the flag? What have they got on their Facebook page? So we're kind of wanting to do that kind of quite hybrid method, and hoping that we can find something that works for that. And then we hope that it will eventually feed into a wider community-based project, leaving that quite loose as what that might look like, because we really want to take that from the data from our participants and using these initial kind of go along, potentially hybrid interviews as a starting point to see what some of the tension points in and we're planning on doing it in a very localised communities as well, maybe even not just Leeds, but around where we live, to try and I guess understand, put it in context of ourselves as well as our participants, and really have a bit of that kind of auto and that ethnographic stuff going in there. So loads of ideas, but in the early stage. So looking forward to hearing your questions and comments. I think just conclusions is that we're hoping that this will tie into some kind of resistance to diversity tactics, and that we recognise that there is need for critical intervention on many fronts, from critical scholars and from activists, and hoping that we can create a bit of a wider project for this, but starting small. Thank you.